Childhood friends Shayna Gibson and Joe Alsop seemed destined for each other.
He was my lover, he was my companion, he was my soulmate.
But when tragedy rocked their marriage, despair would soon follow.
I was in disbelief. I didn't want to believe it.
I just felt like somebody had just ripped my heart from my chest.
Just when Shayna had had enough, a confession from an unlikely source would emerge.
She can tell that he was lying because he couldn't even look her straight in the face.
And spark a wildfire of horrific secrets about Shayna's lifelong partner.
I have never come up with a real answer as to why somebody would commit an offense like this.
I just hit my knees screaming and crying. Why couldn't it have been me? Why did it have to be her?
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Shayna Gibson never thought true love would find her so early.
I met Joe Alsop in 1989 when I was 4 and he was 6. He lived only 8 doors down from me and we became best friends.
Growing up outside San Antonio, Texas, Shayna and Joe spent their summers playing games and riding bikes till dusk.
Joseph lived in Oregon with his dad, and he would only come down on summer breaks.
But all good things must come to an end. And in June of 1997, 12-year-old Shayna received disappointing news.
I had gone down to his mom's house and knocked on the door, and she answered, and she's like, "No, sweetie, they didn't come down this summer." She never really gave me any specific reason why he wasn't coming.
Shayna missed Joe, but just 1 year later, in the spring of 1998, Joe returned to Texas, and this time he was there to stay. But by Shayna's freshman year in high school, the once solid friendship had drifted apart.
Joe started changing as far as falling in with the wrong crowds and just hanging out with the wrong people.
So in December of 2002, after Joe's high school graduation, Shayna was pleasantly surprised to learn Joe was joining the Army.
It seemed like the structure of the military was really what he needed in his life in order to keep him functioning right.
Just as Joe departed for basic training, the childhood friendship rekindled. Meanwhile, Shayna took on the role of a lifetime when she delivered a baby boy named Zach from a previous relationship.
But Joe was always there. Even if he wasn't there physically, he was always calling or writing letters, letting me know, hey, if you need anything, I'm here for you.
A short time later, when Joe was deployed to Iraq, Shayna and Joe became frequent pen pals. Before long, something suddenly clicked, and the two realized their friendship had become much more.
We just decided that when he came home for his leave in November that we were going to spend time together, and come to find out, right before he left to go back, I was pregnant.
Joe and Shayna seemed to love each other, absolutely happy days.
Following Joe's stint in Iraq, the happy couple threw caution to the wind. And on April Fool's Day of 2004, a 4-month pregnant Shayna married her best friend, Joe.
We went to the courthouse, got our marriage license, went over to the Justice of the Peace, and 30 minutes later, we were married.
As the early days of married life rolled along, the newlyweds happily anticipated the birth of their first daughter.
We were very confident that it didn't matter what life brought us, that we were going to make it through it.
But life was hiding some dangerous secrets. And just 6 years later, a devastating series of events would threaten the very core of Shayna's fairy tale. By June of 2010, Shayna had a sneaking suspicion something was bothering her 7-year-old son, Zach.
Joe and I were fighting a lot, and I was scared that it would affect the kids.
So when Zach came home from school and went straight to his room, Shayna knew it was time for an intervention.
So then I just asked him, what was bothering him. And that's when he started telling me. And I knew without a shadow of a doubt, I had to believe my child. So I just picked up the phone and I called the cops.
But what Shayna learned was only the first layer of deceit, something so horrific that nothing would ever be the same again.
I felt like something wasn't right, but I never would have guessed what was actually happening.
I felt like I was dying all over again.
In July of 2004, 6 years before Shayna Gibson would discover the unthinkable, she and her husband Joe Alsop were on top of the world.
We were happy. We decided that since we were having a girl, that it should be Daddy's little girl. So we gave her Joe's initials, Jade Elise Alsop.
And on August 6th, Shayna gave birth to a beautiful baby, Jade. But soon after Jade's arrival, Shayna's happiness turned to disappointment when Joe showed little interest in being a father.
He would either zone out and play video games, or he'd go to a friend's house and pretty much be gone all evening long.
Shayna hoped her husband was just going through a phase. But one early morning in November of 2004, Joe's detachment became outright alarming.
I noticed that the baby was just having a really hard time breathing. She was gasping for air, and Joe was more concerned on being to work on time than he was about the baby not breathing or having the high fever.
Shayna wasn't taking any chances and immediately drove Jade to the hospital.
They didn't have an explanation as to why she wasn't able to breathe that morning. They just said she had a virus and that they were going to go ahead and send her home.
Back home with her family, Shayna had high hopes her husband would start pulling his weight. But soon, Shayna's problems with Joe would take a back seat as she embarked on the worst night of her life. On January 27th, 2005, Shayna Gibson headed out with a friend to run a quick errand.
I peeked in the room, checked on Jade. She looked to be sleeping just fine, and so I grabbed my friend Heather, got downstairs, got the car started.
But before they left the driveway, Shayna looked over to see Joe running down the stairs with baby Jade. In a state of disbelief, Shayna jumped out of the car and ran straight toward Joe.
By the time I got to the end of our staircase, Joe was down in the front yard with my daughter and was performing CPR on her because she wasn't breathing.
Neighbors flocked toward the chaotic scene as several people called 911.
EMS arrived and they were able to recover a heartbeat. So my neighbor, she says, "You're in no condition to drive, let me take you to the hospital." When we got to the emergency room, I ran inside and I told them who I was. I didn't even get to the room where my daughter was before the doctor stopped me and said, "We tried to save her." But it was already too late. And I just remember falling to my knees and screaming, "God, why me?" Joe sat right there in that trauma room with me and just cried and held her. The night that Jade passed, she was 5 months and 22 days old.
Despite her immense grief, Shayna needed answers. And in February of 2005, almost 1 month after Jade's death, her autopsy report came back from the lab. The results were inconclusive, but Shayna was troubled by one of the findings.
She had the petechiae around the neck and the capillaries. Petechiae is usually seen in strangulation, lack of air movement.
But when Shayna questioned authorities about her findings, she got nothing but closed doors.
I said, "Can you explain some of this to me?" And he says, "Well, we've already ruled her death or undetermined causes." He says, "There's really been no conclusion of foul play."
It seemed that Jade's file was closed for good. And as Shayna's unanswered questions only fueled her despair, Joe's behavior made things even worse.
I needed him to understand why I was hurting. He always just wanted me to deal with it on my own or call my mom. That was always his answer. "Just call your mom, she'll fix it."
Joe's distance was causing a strain on everyone. And Shayna couldn't help but wonder what was really bothering her husband.
Everybody I talked to was shocked.
she fell to the floor and she was just crying.
And every day I woke up and I thought, this is a nightmare.
In the spring of 2005, Shayna Gibson's heart was broken after the sudden death of her 5-month-old daughter, Jade.
So I was helpless. Nobody knew how to help me. Nobody could give me the hope that one day I might find out what happened to her.
To make matters worse, Shayna's husband and Jade's father, Joe Alsop, seemed to be grieving very differently, if at all.
Joe felt very cold to me, almost like he didn't have a heart anymore. He didn't know how to feel.
The intimate nights between Shayna and Joe had become few and far between. So in late April of 2005, Shayna wasn't at all prepared to learn she was once again pregnant.
I was devastated because I thought, how do I handle a child after just losing one?
That same day, Joe left for Iraq on his 3rd tour, and Shayna and her son Zach moved home to be closer to Shayna's mother.
I felt like he was gone and I didn't have any family up there to support me.
In November of 2005, Shayna delivered a baby boy named Joshua. 4 months later, Joe returned from Iraq to meet his son for the first time. Shayna desperately wanted a renewed family with her husband at the helm, but her dreams were soon dashed.
We fought constantly. I just thought, it's just another rough patch. Marriages have these, and we'll get through it.
In June, Joe's 4-year commitment to the Army was up, and when it came time for re-enlistment, he decided to part ways. But as the months went by with no sign of Joe looking for work, Shayna could feel her marriage slipping away. And in the summer of 2006, she would finally understand why.
Zach was 3 years old, and he just told me, he says, "Mommy, while you're at work, this blonde lady comes to see Daddy." When she comes over, I get told to go play in my room, and her and Daddy go in y'all's room and shut the door.
Shayna immediately confronted Joe, who insisted that it was all make-believe.
Joe just stated, he's a child. He's going to make up stories.
Shayna decided that Joe deserved one last shot. And in early 2007, Joe came through for his family when he landed a new job.
I felt very relieved because I thought he's going to start being the husband that he was when I married him. He's going to start being the best friend that I had growing up.
But just weeks into the job, Shayna received a surprising phone call.
I got a call from his boss one night saying that Joe would not come in or clocked in yet. And I told his boss, I said, well, he left here at 9:30 to come to work, so I don't know why he's not there yet.
Since Joe had the family car, Shayna called her friend Amy for help.
So we started driving by friends' houses that I thought he might be at instead of going to work until I ran across one friend's house that we used to go to school with. And there was my car in her driveway. I was done. I said, that's it.
I was kind of hoping that he would be better than that, but unfortunately he wasn't.
On January 27th, 2007, exactly 2 years after Jade's death, Shayna kicked Joe out for good. Over the next 2 years, Joe re-enlisted in the military and was deployed once again to Iraq. As Shayna continued with the separation, she met and started dating a caring man named Joshua. But in June of 2010, Shayna's fairy tale would take another unthinkable turn. One afternoon, when her 7-year-old son Zach came home from school visibly upset, Shayna decided to confront him.
He just told me that someone had touched him, and he just started crying, and he was just like, "Mommy, when you were working, Daddy Joe would do this to me." I was shocked. I didn't know how to feel.
If Joe had molested Zach, Shayna wondered if her other children had been victims of the same heinous crime. And if Joe was capable of assaulting his own stepson, what else could he possibly have gotten away with?
Jade immediately came to mind. Said, I want my daughter's death investigation reopened.
Shayna felt the blood drain from her face as she picked up the phone and dialed 911.
To me, this seemed to be a very heinous crime.
I just heard Shayna yell, I want that bastard to get the death penalty.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In June of 2010, Shayna Gibson was heartbroken after a shocking confession from her son, Zach. The 7-year-old had come clean about sexual abuse at the hands of Shayna's ex-husband, Joe Alsop.
I was shocked. I didn't know how to feel. So I just picked up the phone and I called the cops.
The police department responded immediately and asked Shayna to bring Zach in for questioning.
Zach was still very adamant, Daddy Joe has done this to me. So the investigators investigated Joe all summer long while he spent the rest of his tour in Iraq.
The search would not be in vain, as detectives uncovered a sealed document from Joe's past.
The officer told me that he was convicted at the age of 14 of sexual assault on a child.
Shayna's mind was spinning. How could Joe have kept this a secret? And then Shayna remembered something from her childhood. The one summer Joe hadn't come to stay in Texas was the summer he had turned 14.
He was supposed to have been registered sex offender in the state of Texas and his home state, which he never was.
There are some juveniles who are able to steal their records, and sometimes that information isn't known.
I was devastated. I thought, this is not the person I knew. This is not the person I married.
Joe's childhood secret was now police evidence. And with Joe due back from Iraq in one short month, officers decided it was best to wait and interview him in person.
When Joe came home in July of 2010, they picked him up, and Joe went without a fight.
It wasn't long before Joe broke. On August 16th, Shayna received a life-changing phone call.
The investigator called me at like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and he tells me Joe has written a 12-page confession on everything he has ever done to both of your boys, your daughter, and several children outside of the family.
Horror set in as Shayna's mind flashed back to events from the past. Joe had confessed to sexually abusing Jade, but Shayna wondered if there could be more to his story.
I think if he can do this to my children, to his own children, who's to say he couldn't kill my daughter?
Just 2 days later, on August 18th, 2010, police confirmed Shayna's worst fears.
He finally gave in and wrote down another confession of what he did to Jade.
Mr. Alsop confessed to touching his daughter, and it started a process in which his daughter started to choke. She subsequently had her airway closed, and she basically died from not being able to breathe. After that, Mr. Alsop then put on an act of picking his daughter up, calling Shayna, saying that she needed to call 911, something was wrong. And at that particular time, 911 was called.
When officers asked Shayna what punishment prosecutors should seek against Joe, she didn't think twice.
I'm not an evil person, but if I could choose the right penalty for him, it would have to be death row.
As the weeks dragged by, the prosecution's capital murder charge against Joe Alsop seemed riskier by the day.
Given the complexity of the matter and what has to be proven in the capital murder case, we came to the conclusion that if he was willing to plea and be locked in prison without the possibility of parole for the rest of his life, that would be sufficient punishment for him. And also, that would be a way that Shayna wouldn't have to relive everything through trial.
In September 2011, the prosecution agreed to drop the capital murder charge if Joe would plead guilty to 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault on a child.
I went to the sentencing date, and Joe was cold. His eyes were black. He was heartless. He had absolutely no emotion.
On February 28, 2012, Joe Alsop took the plea deal and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences.
I know that at some point I have to forgive him for what he's done. And that may take a lifetime for me to learn how to do that.
Today, Shayna Gibson is moving forward with her health, happiness, and peace.
I would like to be speaking out to children who have been through this, who don't know how to come forward.
I mean, some of the worst stuff I can imagine, we've already been through, so it'll be pretty positive from here on out.
Despite all odds, Shayna's son Zach seems to have inherited his mother's strength. And through it all, Shayna's real fairy tale has stood the test of time.
Joshua is an amazing blessing to my life and to my children's lives. My life today is more than I could have ever asked for.
When George Cascone fell for the shy and stunning Dorothy Luther, he wasted no time putting a ring on her finger.
She was very attentive. She was what I wanted in a wife.
They were madly in love with each other. It just seemed like everything was perfect.
But George didn't know that deep inside his teenage sweetheart was a diabolical woman,
She's the closest to pure evil that I've ever come across.
willing to go to any length to possess everything.
She was going to follow through with her plan.
I gave her everything. I gave her the means to destroy me.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Good Italian Catholic boys always listen to their mother, and Kansas City native George Cascone was no exception.
I was a mommy's boy. My dad died when I was 11, so she was my mother and my father. I did everything my mom wanted me to do.
That included getting his mother's approval when it came to girls. So in September 1969, when a friend introduced 17-year-old George to a young beauty named Dorothy Luther, he immediately brought her home to meet his mother. Dorothy was sweet and shy, and George's mom took an instant liking to the girl.
My mom took her under her wing, more or less, and her and my mom were almost like best friends.
Under his mother's approving eye, George and Dorothy formed a close friendship, one that soon blossomed into love.
She was real quiet. She was real good looking. I was drawn to her because she had the same values that I had, and family and home and things like that.
My sister told me she found this fabulous guy. He had a great family, and that he would take care of her. This was like her knight in shining armor.
In the summer of 1973, George and Dorothy decided it was high time they made it official. That August, the two were married by the Justice of the Peace, with a few close friends and family in attendance.
Just had a couple of people. My mom was there, one of my best friends. I was happy. It was anticipation, a new life together.
My sister was extremely eager to get married. It was like a mission. George seemed nervous, a little edgy, but my sister, she was on her game. She was ready to go.
After their honeymoon, the newlyweds easily slipped into the peaceful routine of marriage. Dorothy was a doting wife who worked at a local restaurant, while George finished college and worked several jobs.
We lived in my mom's house and saved money to buy a house. She was a good wife. We very seldom argued or fought. She was very, very quiet, very reserved. I worked in a grocery store, and I also worked in a body shop and had a job selling real estate. My mom raised me to work, and that's what I did.
In 1976, the young couple welcomed a baby girl into the world. And by the following year, George bought his new family their own home. But shortly after the birth of their daughter, George began to glimpse a different side of his once loving wife.
Dorothy had changed. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. She became more vocal, very opinionated, very, dominating, controlling.
Dorothy also seemed utterly indifferent to George's personal belongings.
It was gradual. I noticed my stuff started dwindling. I'd have a few keepsake items on the shelf, and she would just box it all up and put it in the garage. I asked her, I said, where's this, where's that? She goes, oh, I'll get it out. I can't do it right now. I'll do that later. Later never happened.
George wished his wife would be more considerate, but he had no time to wallow. As the household bills piled up, George worked even longer hours, while Dorothy constantly berated him.
All I was doing was working. There was no winning. She'd say, what are you going to do with these bills? She'd bring a big stack of bills out and she says, what are you going to do? Made me feel like the lowest thing on the planet.
George tried to keep his chin up and continue doing what he thought best for his family. But as the years went on, Dorothy's behavior went from bad to worse to outright horrifying. On the evening of July 5th, 2010, George was entertaining friends at home when suddenly around midnight there was a knock at his front door.
I went to the door and it was the police and the FBI. And they asked me to step out and talk to them, and I asked them what they were here for.
We explained to him what had been going on with Dorothy. We began to believe that she was going to follow through with her plan. She referred to the entire thing as a game.
She thought she was above the law.
In the spring of 1979, 31 years before George Gasconi received some shocking news, he was working hard to provide a good life for his wife Dorothy and their 3-year-old daughter.
I was always double jobbing it, always working all the time. I want to make sure they didn't long for something or feel like they were doing without.
George was thriving in his professional life. He took on a string of rental properties and buildings, and money finally began coming in. But the road to marital bliss was becoming bumpier than ever.
She controlled everything I did. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. Now she's just 180 degrees the other way.
And by 1984, after their second daughter was born, another set of problems surfaced.
The spending is where it really kind of started. It seemed like the spending just would spiral out of control. It was crazy.
Dorothy would buy anything and everything. She loved to buy shoes, clothes, and anything shiny or glittery. Or if it had a leopard print on it, she was all for it.
I told her we had to put the brakes on the credit cards. She just went into a rage and just started ransacking the place. She started knocking everything over, tearing everything up, just going totally bonkers. So I just backed off.
George decided to focus on keeping the peace with his wife, but Dorothy seemed to have other plans. One night in June of 1985, George came home to find his wife fuming over an unsigned insurance claim check.
A big hailstorm hit Kansas City. When the check came for the hail damage, I didn't see it. When I got home, she goes, "You didn't sign that check." She made it sound like I wouldn't sign it, like it was something that was my fault. She got so mad.
But there was more to the story. Dorothy finally admitted that she had tried to cash the check anyway.
She just told me she was in a hurry. She ran to the bank, stuffed it in the teller's face, and they wouldn't cash it because it wasn't signed. So she was mad.
Dorothy's insatiable appetite for money was troubling. Still, George did his best to keep his marriage together. But the distance between the couple only grew. That same year, a frustrated and demoralized George sought comfort in the arms of a close friend.
I just wanted to find a little happiness for myself, but I didn't feel good about it. Dorothy found out about the affair. She was enraged. I did apologize to her numerous times, but it just made her more enraged to talk about it.
By now, George knew the way to his wife's heart was through his wallet.
I just threw more money at it, just let her have more control of my money. I did hope things would get better.
By the summer of 1986, things finally seemed to be looking up. George opened his own auto body shop in Kansas City, and Dorothy offered to do her part for the family business.
She was there all the time. She paid all the bills and wrote all the checks and took care of everything.
George hoped the joint venture would help their marriage. But by the end of that year, he began noticing large amounts of money missing from his business.
I was working 20 hours a day and still broke, and I knew that some of the dealership accounts were 10, 12 grand a month. I mean, I should have had more money.
George had a sinking feeling his wife was stealing from him.
I just kind of turned a blind eye to it. I thought that I owed it to her for what I'd done, having the affair.
So in 1991, George suggested that Dorothy open her own business, a wig salon, in one of his properties.
Well, I had hoped that she would be able to make enough money to be able to support her lifestyle the way she wanted to.
But over time, it became clear that Dorothy had no intention of leaving George's bank account alone.
She just always took my money to run her business. She paid all her employees out of my checking account. She paid her utilities and her insurance out of my checking account. I just tolerated it because I felt like I owed it to her for what I did. I tried to pay her back every way I could.
I think my sister is probably the most greedy person I've ever known in my life. She just has to have everything. It was almost like a game to her.
By 1996, the couple's already strained relationship only got worse when George's mother became ill. When she passed away 3 years later, the last remaining connection George and Dorothy had was severed.
Almost immediately, she served me with the final divorce papers. She was more revealing in her hostility after my mom died.
With his troubled marriage finally over, George set his sights on a more peaceful future. But things with Dorothy weren't over just yet. In fact, they were about to get much, much worse.
When I found out she sold his body to science, I was just in shock.
She had transformed into a monster.
In the summer of 1999, after a 26-year tumultuous marriage, George and his wife Dorothy Casconi called it quits. Despite everything, George was determined to make sure Dorothy wanted for nothing.
In the divorce, I let her have numerous properties, all my car collection, and everything that I had, all the houses, everything. Felt like I had to protect her.
There was just one thing George wanted to hold on to: his mother's house.
I wanted to keep that. I built that house with my mom in 1965, and I designed it. The house meant a lot to me. It was a very sentimental place to me.
But George didn't know that Dorothy had plans of her own.
She got my mother's house. When I signed off the rental properties to her, she attached the legal description to those documents as if I had signed it off with the other rental properties. And so she successfully got it from me lock, stock, and barrel. I felt real stupid. That was one of the things I cherished the most.
It's a big control issue with her because she wants to be totally in control of everything. And it was just important to her. It's almost like to be superior.
Even worse, shortly after their divorce, Dorothy remarried. George decided it was time to play hardball.
When I bought a new building, she wanted to put her wig shop in there real bad. She says, "Is there anything I can do to get my business in your new building?" You know, rent-free, of course. And I said, "I think you want something from me. I want something from you. You can sign me back on my mom's house." And she just was kind of taken aback by it.
But ultimately, the deal was too sweet for Dorothy to resist. And in 2002, she reluctantly agreed to George's terms. George hoped the battles with his ex-wife were now over. But by 2006, tensions between George and Dorothy reached a new level.
Dorothy was struggling in her business. She wasn't focused on her business. She was more focused on her image.
I got tired of paying the taxes. I sold the building, so she had to get completely out. She was real mad and outraged. It was one of the best things I ever did. She finally ended up moving her business into her house. So at that point, effectively, she was what they call belly up.
George was relieved to wash his hands of his irresponsible ex, especially when he got wind of a disturbing bit of news. In 2009, Dorothy's second husband passed away. Everyone was horrified to discover what Dorothy did with his body.
Immediately, she sold his body to science so that she could get the money for that, and she wouldn't have to pay for a funeral to cut the expenses. I think you get something like $250 or something like that. I mean, it's so minimal, it's crazy. I was just in shock.
She talked about it several times. She talked about doing the same thing with George. It's a cheap way out. I was angry. I was angry for his family.
She's very methodical. I felt really lucky I got divorced when I did.
By 2010, George had finally moved on, leaving the ugly memory of his ex-wife's scheming behind. Until July 5th, when George had some unexpected visitors.
I was at home with my friends here. We were just hanging around. It was late at night, around 12:30, and somebody was knocking on the door. I went to the door, and it was the police and the FBI.
We wanted to let George know what was going on and what we had done to protect his safety. We asked him to step outside.
They said, "We have something to tell you. Did you made anybody mad recently?" And I said, "Well, my business, I make a lot of people mad." And they said, "Well, what about in the past?"
George answered with the one person he knew disliked him in all of Kansas City.
And I immediately knew it was my ex-wife. And they said, "Well, we have her in custody down for a murder for hire plot to have you killed." I was surprised to think that she would hate me that much after I'd helped her.
But that was just the beginning. What really floored George was how Dorothy had gone about her insidious plan.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On July 5th, 2010, George Cascone was standing on his doorstep dumbfounded as federal agents and local police delivered some unbelievable news.
They said, "Well, we have your ex-wife in custody down for a murder for hire plot to have you killed."
Investigators went on to say that Dorothy Cascone had attempted to hire a hitman to do away with George. But instead of doing the job, the hitman went straight to the FBI.
He had known Dorothy for several weeks and had somewhat of a relationship with her. He believed that this was a credible threat.
The would-be hitman told the FBI that Dorothy wanted George shot around midnight on the 4th of July.
She wanted it done on that day because of the fireworks that were going off for the 4th of July, and she believed that this would minimize any kind of other individual hearing what was going on. He provided 3 handwritten drawings that Dorothy had given him of the different levels of the home, a .38 caliber handgun that was loaded.
He also told the FBI that Dorothy offered him $2,000 to kill George. The FBI immediately contacted the Kansas City Police Department, and together they planned an undercover sting operation using the informant.
We provided this individual with the recorder, and he was then sent back to Dorothy Cascone's home. He asked Dorothy, "How do you want George shot? 1 time, 2 times?" She responded, "I don't care, I just want him dead." After the money exchange and the loaded weapons and hearing the conversations, we were confident that there was an actual threat to George.
The FBI and police wasted no time. They arrested Dorothy and charged her with first-degree assault.
My older niece called me and said, "You need to turn the TV on. Mom's on TV." And I said, "What channel?" I thought, gosh, she's really done a good job this time.
After the FBI informed George of Dorothy's arrest, a news crew showed up at his home later that day. And he was not shy in expressing how he felt.
The part that insulted me the most is the fact she was going to pay the hitman so little money. I mean, $2,000 is just not enough money.
George also had a little piece of advice for his ex-wife.
She should have took somebody from out of town, Chicago or New York, and she should have paid him at least 10 grand. 2 grand is not enough to get that kind of work done right. So instead, she get what you pay for.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
Shortly after his ex-wife's arrest, George learned that Dorothy had several life insurance policies she had taken out in his name. If her plan had gone off without a hitch, she could have inherited close to $1 million.
She would have ended up with this house, my buildings, and I guess $1 million almost.
On March 29, 2011, Dorothy Casconi pleaded guilty to second-degree assault. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
I was pretty shocked for what she had done. I thought that was a pretty light sentence.
When someone who's never had any control and never had any money, and you suddenly give them power and control, they can't handle it. It goes to their head. She wanted to call all the shots on everything, and for a long time she did, and I allowed it.
Today, George is still struggling to move past everything that happened, so he focuses most of his energy on his business and his beloved granddaughter.
I don't have to work 20 hours a day. I don't have somebody stealing money from me constantly. I get to see my granddaughter more now, and I get to build a relationship with her. That's important.
George is still pretty much himself. That's one of the things I like. He doesn't put on this fake persona. He remains true to who he is.
Still, George admits that forming new relationships has been tough.
I'd never get married again. When you get married, you give someone the legal right to totally jack you over. It's like, here, take everything. Here's my keys. I surrender. I can't do that for anybody now.
It begins with a sound that never made it into any police report, a sound no one could ever quite agree on, a sharp metallic clatter echoing through a narrow London alley just after midnight, swallowed almost instantly by rain, traffic, and the low, restless hum of a city that never really sleeps, and by the time anyone thought to ask what that sound was, it had already turned into something else, something heavier, something that would sit in the back of London's mind for 2 decades. Unresolved, unnamed, and quietly rotting beneath headlines that stopped caring far too quickly. The street was Archer's Row, a thin, crooked vein running behind a row of late-night shops in South London, the kind of place delivery drivers cut through to save 30 seconds and teenagers used because it was dark and no one was watching, slick with rain that night, reflecting broken neon signs in puddles that trembled every time a bus thundered past on the main road, and at 12:47 a.m., a security camera mounted above a closed-off license caught a woman stepping into frame, coat collar pulled high, head down, walking fast, as if she already knew she was late. Her name was Hannah Cole, 29 years old, a junior legal assistant who lived alone in a rented flat less than a mile away. No criminal record. No known enemies. No dramatic secrets that anyone could point to at the time. She had left a friend's birthday gathering less than 15 minutes earlier, sending a text that said she'd made it outside, that she'd call when she got home, and that message would later be replayed in courtrooms, newsrooms, and police briefing rooms, read aloud with a weight it was never meant to carry. The camera footage showed her disappear behind a parked van. Then nothing. Just rain streaking down the lens. Headlights flaring white, then gone. At 1:12 a.m., a passerby found her body less than 20 meters from where the camera last saw her, lying on her side, one shoe missing, eyes open, rain pooling beneath her cheek, and the first officer on scene would later say the silence felt wrong, too thick, as if the alley itself was holding its breath. By dawn, Archer's Row was cordoned off with blue and white tape that fluttered uselessly in the wind, residents peering from upstairs windows in dressing gowns, shop owners whispering behind shuttered doors, the word murder already moving faster than the facts, because London knows this rhythm well, the brief shock, the tightening in the chest, the sudden realization that something terrible can happen one street away without warning, without reason, without explanation. The initial assessment was brutal in its simplicity. Blunt force trauma. No obvious weapon recovered. No clear signs of robbery. Her phone was missing, her handbag still slung across her body, cash untouched. There were no defensive wounds that told a clean story, no neat timeline that investigators could walk through with confidence, just a scattering of small details that refused to line up, scuff marks on wet concrete, a partial footprint smudged beyond recognition, fibers on her coat that didn't match anything in the immediate area. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood while the memory was still warm, knocking on doors, waking people who would swear they heard nothing, saw nothing, noticed nothing unusual at all, and the ones who did remember something couldn't agree on what it was. A raised voice. Maybe a man and a woman arguing, or maybe laughter, or maybe just the sound of a bottle breaking. The kind of noise that didn't earn a second glance in a city trained to keep moving. Within 48 hours, the tabloids had arrived. Flashing cameras. Block capitals. A smiling photograph of Hannah pulled from social media, cropped just right, paired with words like mystery, brutal, and fear grips London. And for a brief moment, the case felt alive, electric, as if sheer attention alone might force the truth into the open. Police released the grainy CCTV still, the timestamp burned into the corner, and asked for help identifying anyone who had been in Archer's Row that night.
Tips flooded in. Hundreds of them.
Then thousands. Most went nowhere. There was the man in the dark hoodie seen boarding a night bus 3 streets away. The white van spotted idling with its engine running. The bartender, who thought Hannah had been arguing with someone earlier in the evening. Each lead sparked hope, then fizzled out under scrutiny. Alibis checked, timelines collapsed, faces crossed off lists, and as days turned into weeks, the investigation slowed, not officially, never officially, but in the quiet ways that only detectives notice, fewer officers assigned, fewer updates to the family, fewer journalists calling for comment. Hannah's parents stood on the steps of the Metropolitan Police headquarters and begged for answers, their voices cracking as they spoke about a daughter who always rang when she got home, a daughter who never took shortcuts through dark alleys unless she felt safe, and the city listened, briefly, before attention drifted elsewhere, as it always does. Another crime, another name, another headline. Inside the case file, though, the unanswered questions piled up. Why was her phone never recovered, never pinged, never sold, never switched on again? Why did forensic analysis find traces of soil on her coat inconsistent with Archer's Row, soil that matched a park nearly 2 miles away? Why did one witness insist they saw 2 figures running, not one, moments after the estimated time of death, only to later retract the statement under pressure, confusion, or fear? Detectives ran background checks that turned up nothing solid. Former partners, co-workers, neighbors. Everyone was interviewed. Everyone denied involvement. The case refused to give them a villain, refused to offer a clean narrative, and without that, momentum bled away. By the end of 2004, the words cold case were being used quietly, reluctantly, in internal meetings, never in public, never in front of the family, but written in margins, spoken in lowered voices, an admission that London had failed to protect one of its own and didn't yet know why. Years passed. Archer's Row was repaved. The off-license changed owners. The security camera was upgraded, then replaced entirely. New residents moved in who had never heard Hannah's name, and for them, the alley was just another shortcut, another forgettable stretch of concrete, unaware they were walking over a question mark that had never been erased. But some things didn't fade. Her mother kept the phone charged, just in case. Her father attended every anniversary vigil, standing in the rain with a photograph that never aged. And somewhere in the Metropolitan Police archives, a box sat on a shelf, labeled simply, unemotionally, Cole, Hannah, 2003, filled with evidence that hadn't spoken yet, waiting, silently, for the day someone would listen differently. Because what no one knew then, standing under flashing lights in that wet London alley, was that the answer had already brushed past them, hidden in plain sight, embedded in a detail so ordinary it was dismissed without ceremony, a name written down and crossed out, a moment caught on tape and forgotten, a truth that would stay buried not because it was impossible to find, but because for 20 years, no one asked the right question at the right time, and the city kept moving, unaware that the Shadow left behind in 2003 was still growing, still watching, still waiting to be seen. The file didn't close. It never really does in cases like this. It simply went quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in slowly, like dust on forgotten shelves, while the city outside kept breathing, kept expanding, kept pretending nothing was wrong. And inside Scotland Yard, the name Hannah Cole slipped from daily briefings into archived folders, from urgent priority to unresolved anomaly, a cold case in everything but ink. In the months after her death, detectives reconstructed her final hours again and again, replaying the night like a damaged tape that refused to run cleanly, starting with the pub on Camden Road where the birthday gathering had spilled into laughter and cheap wine. Witnesses remembering Hannah as relaxed, distracted, checking her watch more than once, saying she had an early meeting, declining a shared taxi, insisting the walk was short, familiar, safe. CCTV confirmed she left alone. No one followed her out the door. No obvious shadow. No raised voices. Nothing that screamed danger. That absence became its own problem. Most violent crimes announce themselves early, with friction, with warning signs, with emotional debris scattered long before the final act. But Hannah's night was smooth, almost boring, right up until it wasn't, and investigators struggled with the idea that something so final could erupt out of something so ordinary. They traced her usual routes home, mapped alternatives she sometimes took when it rained, questioned shopkeepers who recognized her face, the late-night newsagent who remembered selling her a bottle of water weeks earlier, the kebab shop owner who thought he'd seen her pass by around midnight but couldn't be sure. Her phone records were pulled, combed through line by line, revealing nothing more scandalous than missed calls from her mother and a voicemail from a colleague complaining about deadlines. But one detail lingered, a call she never returned, logged at 12:32 a.m., less than 15 minutes before the estimated time of death, from a number not saved in her contacts, registered to a prepaid mobile purchased with cash. Police traced it as far as they could. The trail ended quickly. The phone was never used again. Forensics brought no clean answers either. The fibers found on her coat were initially dismissed as environmental contamination, the kind of thing that happens when a body lies exposed to weather and foot traffic, but one analyst flagged them anyway: synthetic strands consistent with industrial carpeting, not concrete, not soil, not anything native to Archer's Row. A note scribbled in the margin suggesting a secondary location, a place Hannah had been before she died, or a place she had been taken. The theory was debated, then shelved, lacking supporting evidence, too speculative for a case already drowning in maybes. Witness statements blurred together over time. A taxi driver thought he'd seen a couple arguing near the alley entrance, but couldn't describe faces. A woman walking her dog claimed she heard footsteps running, fast, uneven, as if someone was limping. A man living above the off-license told police he'd been awake, watching television, and heard nothing at all. Each account added noise, not clarity, and the more investigators pushed, the more resistant the truth became, retreating into contradiction. By early 2004, pressure mounted quietly from above. Resources were finite. New cases demanded attention. Detectives were reassigned. The team shrank. Hannah's parents noticed the shift immediately, the way calls went unanswered a little longer, the way updates grew vague, careful, non-committal, and when they pushed back, when they asked how a woman could vanish and die within sight of a camera without anyone being held responsible, they were met with sympathetic silence and procedural language that offered comfort without answers. The media moved on, but not entirely. Once a year, usually around the anniversary, Hannah's face resurfaced, framed by words like unsolved and mystery remains, and for a brief moment the city remembered her, then forgot again, a cycle as predictable as the seasons. Online forums began to fill the gaps left by official statements, armchair detectives dissecting grainy footage, zooming into pixels, arguing over shadows and timestamps, constructing elaborate theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Some insisted it was a random attack. Others were convinced it was someone she knew, someone overlooked, someone protected. Inside the police archive, the case file grew heavier, without growing clearer. New technology arrived slowly. Promises of better DNA analysis, improved image enhancement, tools that could see what human eyes had missed, but Hannah's evidence was old, degraded, compromised by time and rain and early investigative limitations, and every advancement came with a caveat, a reason it might not apply here. Then, in 2009, a minor breakthrough flickered into existence and almost immediately died. A review of cold cases flagged Hannah's file due to similarities with another unsolved assault nearby, same time frame, same general area, same absence of clear motive. Detectives compared notes, cross-referenced suspects, and for a few weeks, the investigation felt alive again. Officers pulling late nights, re-interviewing witnesses who had long since moved on with their lives, reopening wounds that never fully healed. The link didn't hold. The cases diverged under scrutiny. Hope collapsed quietly, without ceremony. Years layered themselves on top of the unanswered questions. Hannah's parents aged. Detectives retired. Streets changed names. The city forgot the fear it once felt walking home at night through unfamiliar shortcuts, replacing it with new anxieties, new headlines, new victims. And yet, something about the case refused to disappear completely, a sense among those who had touched it that something fundamental had been missed, not hidden deep, not cleverly disguised, but overlooked because it seemed too ordinary to matter. That feeling returned in 2016 when a routine audit of archived evidence uncovered a discrepancy, a small one, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. An evidence bag listed as empty in the database still contained material, a fragment of carpet fiber sealed and labeled, then apparently ignored, its chain of custody intact but dormant. The discovery sparked internal questions, then cautious interest. Why had this been set aside?
Who made that call?
And what else might have been dismissed in the rush to close loops that never truly closed? Still, nothing moved publicly. No press releases. No renewed appeals. Just quiet work behind closed doors, analysts running tests with tools that didn't exist in 2003, comparing data across databases that had only recently begun to talk to one another, chasing patterns instead of people. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shape began to form, not a face yet, not a name, but a silhouette emerging from years of noise, a suggestion that Hannah's death wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous, and wasn't confined to Archer's Row. It pointed outward, to routines, to places people pass through every day without thinking, to interactions so brief they barely registered as memories at all. By the time the realization took hold, by the time investigators understood what they were really looking at, 2 decades had nearly passed since that rainy night in South London, and the truth, long buried beneath assumption and inattention, was ready to surface, not because it demanded to be found, but because someone finally slowed down enough to see what had been there all along, waiting, patiently, for the city to remember how to look. The renewed attention didn't arrive with flashing lights or urgent phone calls. It crept in quietly, almost apologetically, carried by spreadsheets, audit notes, and a growing sense of discomfort among the small review team now assigned to cases long presumed dormant. Detectives too young to remember the fear of 2003 firsthand, analysts trained in a different era, raised on the idea that data remembers what people forget. And as they reopened Hannah Cole's file, they did so without nostalgia, without emotional attachment, only with the uneasy feeling that something about this case had been mishandled in a way no one had ever fully acknowledged. They started where cold cases always start again, not with suspects, but with assumptions, questioning the earliest conclusions as if they were strangers, asking why certain paths were taken and others abandoned, why Archer's Row had been treated as the definitive crime scene when evidence hinted at movement, why the absence of witnesses was interpreted as absence of interaction, why a woman could vanish between camera frames and the possibility of someone already being nearby was never fully interrogated. The carpet fiber resurfaced first, not because it was dramatic, but because it was irritating, a detail that didn't belong, a synthetic blend used almost exclusively in commercial buildings in the early 2000s, offices, storage facilities, back rooms of shops, places people passed through without lingering, places that rarely made headlines unless something went wrong. The fiber was retested with updated techniques, yielding a clearer profile, not a brand name, Not yet, but a class narrow enough to eliminate most residential environments, confirming that Hannah had been somewhere else before she died, somewhere controlled, somewhere indoors. That realization forced the timeline to bend. If Archer's row wasn't the primary scene, then her death wasn't a sudden ambush. It was the end of something already in motion, a final act following an interaction that began elsewhere, and that meant Hannah didn't simply stumble into danger. She encountered it, willingly or not, through routine, through habit, through something she had done dozens of times before, without consequence. Investigators rebuilt her last day hour by hour, overlaying maps with transaction records, transport data, weather reports, anything that could anchor her movements to physical locations, and patterns began to emerge, subtle ones, the kind that only appear when viewed from a distance. She left work at the same time most evenings. She walked instead of taking the bus when the weather allowed. She often cut through mixed-use areas, office blocks with ground-floor shops, service corridors connecting streets in ways most people never noticed. One location kept reappearing in proximity to her routines, a small commercial complex near the river, unremarkable, half offices, half storage units, with a late-night car park that stayed open 24 hours, a place she would pass twice a week on her walk home from Camden Road, a place that had existed in 2003 exactly as it did now, unchanged enough to be unsettling. CCTV coverage in that area had been limited at the time, cameras outdated, footage overwritten within days, a dead zone between systems, convenient in ways no one could prove were intentional. The review team flagged it, not as a suspect location but as an anomaly, and anomalies were what they were trained to follow. They cross-referenced maintenance logs, tenant lists, security contracts from that period, discovering gaps that raised eyebrows but stopped short of accusation. Several units had changed hands multiple times. Records were incomplete. Names were missing. People had moved on, retired, died. The past resisted excavation. Attention turned back to the phone call at 12:32 a.m., the one Hannah never returned. In 2003, prepaid mobiles were common enough to be dismissed as dead ends, but by 2020, patterns mattered more than identities. Analysts compared that call to databases of similar unsolved cases, looking for overlaps, clusters, repetition, and they found something unexpected, a handful of cold cases across Greater London, spanning several years, all involving late-night encounters, missing phones, minimal forensic transfer, and victims whose routines intersected with commercial transit spaces, car parks, service corridors, places designed for movement, not memory. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a suggestion, a whisper of continuity where none had been suspected. The kind of thing that makes investigators nervous, because serial patterns carry implications that extend far beyond a single family's grief. Internal discussions grew tense. Was this coincidence? Overreach? Pattern seeking where randomness still ruled? Senior officers were briefed carefully, language softened, conclusions framed as possibilities, not claims. No one wanted to reopen old wounds without certainty, especially not with a case that had already slipped once through institutional cracks. But the data refused to go away. The overlaps persisted, stubborn, inconvenient. Re-interviews began again, this time with a different tone. Witnesses were asked not just what they saw, but where they usually stood, where they walked, what routes they took home, how they moved through spaces that were never meant to be destinations. One former security guard, now living outside London, mentioned casually that he'd once broken up an argument near a car park around that time, a man and a woman late, tense, but nothing violent, nothing worth reporting, except that the man had been oddly calm, apologetic even, as if managing a situation rather than losing control. The description was vague, the date uncertain, the memory fragile, but it was logged. Another detail resurfaced, buried deep in the original notes, a comment from a patrol officer who had arrived early at Archer's Row and noticed faint tire marks near the curb, dismissed as unrelated due to heavy traffic and rain. With fresh eyes, those marks were re-evaluated against vehicle types common in commercial zones at the time, delivery vans, service cars, fleet vehicles, things that blended into the city so thoroughly they became invisible. The theory taking shape was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Hannah hadn't been targeted because she was unique. She had been vulnerable because she was predictable. Her routines had placed her repeatedly within reach of someone who understood movement, understood timing, understood how to exist between cameras and crowds, and who knew that London, vast and distracted, would swallow a single death without choking on it. Still, there was no name, no face, no arrest to justify the growing weight of speculation. Just a sense that the killer, if there was one, hadn't vanished into darkness, but had continued to live openly, moving through the same city, perhaps even through the same streets, benefiting from the assumption that monsters announce themselves, that danger looks different from everyone else. As the 20th anniversary approached, pressure mounted again, not from tabloids this time, but from inside the system itself, from investigators who had learned, painfully, that time doesn't solve crimes, it only rearranges them, scattering pieces until someone decides they're worth gathering again. And somewhere, buried in old employment records and forgotten access logs, a name waited, not dramatic, not infamous, but disturbingly ordinary, attached to a routine so dull it had never once raised suspicion, routine that had intersected with Hannah Cole's life for reasons no one had thought to question, until now. The name didn't jump out at first. It rarely does in cases like this, because it wasn't written in red or underlined or flagged as suspicious. It was typed in black ink on a faded employment roster, sandwiched between dozens of others, ordinary enough to slide past the eye without friction, and that was exactly why it had survived untouched for so long. The review team found it while tracing access privileges connected to the commercial complex near the river, a dull spreadsheet listing contractors, maintenance staff, temporary hires, people whose jobs existed in the background of everyone else's lives. One entry showed late-night access during the winter of 2003, overlapping perfectly with Hannah Cole's routines, a name logged repeatedly, consistently, predictably. At first, it meant nothing. Thousands of people had keys. Thousands passed through those corridors after midnight. But when analysts cross-checked the name against transport records, something shifted. The individual lived nowhere near the complex, nowhere near Hannah's flat either, but his travel patterns placed him repeatedly along her walking routes, not every night, not obsessively, just often enough to suggest overlap rather than coincidence. It was the kind of discovery that made rooms go quiet, not because it proved anything, but because it raised a question no one wanted to ask too loudly yet. They pulled more records.
Parking permits.
Shift schedules. Old pay slips scanned into outdated systems. The picture sharpened slowly, pixel by pixel. He worked irregular hours. He moved between sites. He had legitimate reasons to be where he was, to linger without drawing attention, to approach strangers without raising alarms. And in 2003, no one was tracking patterns the way they were now. No one was overlaying routines with routines, lives with lives, looking for invisible intersections. Detectives debated how to proceed. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no DNA match yet, just a growing alignment of timelines that made the back of a neck prickle. They decided to work outward, not inward, to test the theory without alerting the subject. Old colleagues were contacted under the guise of routine audits. Former supervisors were asked about shift changes they barely remembered. Most recalled nothing unusual. Some remembered him as quiet, reliable, forgettable. One described him as helpful, maybe too helpful, always offering assistance, always volunteering to walk people to their cars late at night, a detail that sat uncomfortably in the room long after it was spoken. The team turned back to Hannah's final hours with new context. The missing phone suddenly felt less random. The lack of obvious struggle felt less like chance and more like control. The soil on her coat, the carpet fibers, the tire marks, pieces that had once floated independently now began to align, forming a path rather than a scatter. A theory emerged, carefully worded, meticulously footnoted. Hannah encountered someone she recognized as legitimate, someone who didn't trigger fear, someone who offered help or guidance or simply conversation, and in doing so, stepped briefly off her routine without realizing she was stepping into danger. Surveillance footage from surrounding areas was re-examined using modern enhancement tools. Faces still blurred, movements still grainy, but patterns of motion became clearer. A vehicle, unremarkable in make and color, appeared in 3 different camera feeds that night, never clearly enough to identify a plate, but consistently enough to establish presence. Its path traced a loop that brushed past the commercial complex, lingered near Archer's Row, then vanished into arterial roads leading south. In 2003, that loop had meant nothing. In 2023, it looked deliberate. The name from the roster was checked against vehicle registrations from the period. Records were incomplete, fragmented by time, but one match surfaced, a fleet vehicle assigned temporarily, logged under a contractor account, its movements never tracked beyond fuel receipts and maintenance notes. The dots connected just enough to suggest intent without proving it, a maddening middle ground that investigators know too well. They needed something harder, something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or data drift. They went back to the fibers, running them through updated databases that cataloged manufacturing batches and distribution channels, technology that didn't exist when Hannah died. The results narrowed the source further, pointing to a specific supplier whose products were sold primarily to commercial facilities in Greater London between 2001 and 2004. Purchase records were requested. Many were gone. Some survived. One invoice listed the complex near the river, dated 6 months before Hannah's death. The room felt smaller after that. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Just heavier. Because narrowing the circle also narrowed responsibility, and with it came the understanding that if this theory held, then the truth had been accessible all along, buried under the assumption that danger announces itself loudly, violently, unmistakably. Investigators prepared to make contact.
Carefully.
Indirectly. A preliminary interview framed as part of a broader review, a conversation designed to observe rather than accuse. They rehearsed questions, anticipated deflections, studied what little personal history they could assemble from public records. No violent past. No criminal convictions. A life that appeared unremarkable to the point of invisibility. When the interview finally happened, 20 years after that rainy night, it took place in a small, neutral room with no cameras and no raised voices. He was polite, cooperative, mildly confused about why anyone would want to talk about a job he'd barely remembered. His answers were measured, calm, occasionally imprecise in ways that could be attributed to time or nerves. But when asked about late-night routines, about walking people to cars, about Archer's Row, something flickered, a hesitation too brief to point to, too subtle to call out, but enough to be noted. He denied knowing Hannah, denied recognizing her name or face, denied being anywhere near the alley that night. His timeline placed him elsewhere, alone, driving between sites, an explanation that fit just well enough to frustrate, just poorly enough to invite scrutiny. Afterward, detectives sat in silence, replaying the interview in their minds, not what he said, but how he said it, the cadence, the pauses, the moments where memory sharpened and where it dissolved. They didn't leave convinced. They left unsettled. Outside, London moved as it always had, buses hissing at stops, crowds surging through stations, shortcuts being taken without thought, without fear. Hannah's parents were informed that the case was active again, that progress was being made, careful words chosen to manage hope as much as expectation. They listened, grateful, exhausted, afraid to believe too much. What no one said aloud yet was that the investigation had crossed a line it could never uncross. The theory was no longer abstract. It was personal. It had a name attached, a life that could be examined, a present that could be disrupted by a past finally refusing to stay buried. And if the pieces continued to align the way they were beginning to, then the city that had forgotten Hannah Cole would soon be forced to remember not just her, but the uncomfortable truth about how easily someone ordinary can hide in plain sight, waiting for time itself to look away. The waiting was deliberate. After the first interview, investigators did nothing visible, no follow-up calls, no requests for records, no sudden pressure that might spook a man who had lived 2 decades believing a moment had passed unnoticed. Silence can be a tool when used correctly, and in this case, it was sharpened with intent. While the subject returned to his routines, Unaware or pretending to be unaware, the team worked quietly behind the scenes, peeling back layers that had accumulated year after year, not with urgency, but with patience learned the hard way. They started with his movements after 2003, mapping addresses, employers, vehicles, relationships, anything that might show deviation or pattern. The timelines stretched long and dull, a life that appeared stable, monotonous, unremarkable. No sudden relocations. No disciplinary actions. No whispers that could be pulled into accusations. He married.
Divorced.
Changed jobs within the same sector. The kind of biography that reassures, that convinces even seasoned professionals that nothing terrible could be hiding there. And yet, woven through it all were gaps, moments unaccounted for, stretches of time no one could quite remember where he was or what he was doing, because no one had reason to remember at all. Investigators revisited the other cold cases flagged earlier, this time with a name to test against shadows. They didn't look for direct matches. They looked for proximity, for subtle overlaps in geography and timing, and they found just enough to keep going. A woman assaulted but not killed near a car park in 2001. A man found unconscious behind a service corridor in 2004, phone missing, memory fractured. Each case had been handled independently, isolated by circumstance, never connected because the connections were thin, almost polite in how easily they could be ignored. Forensic analysts revisited evidence from those cases, comparing fibers, transfer patterns, methods, not to prove a serial offender outright, but to see whether the same hand might have brushed past more than one life. Results came back inconclusive, then suggestive, then frustratingly incomplete. Time had taken its toll. Evidence degraded. Records vanished. Witnesses forgot. But still, a narrative began to hum beneath the surface, low and persistent, like a machine you only notice once it stops. The turning point didn't arrive with a confession or a DNA hit. It arrived with paperwork. An overlooked incident report from 2002 surfaced during a deep archive search, filed by a junior officer responding to a call at the same commercial complex near the river. The report described a complaint from a woman who said a maintenance worker had made her uncomfortable, insisting on helping her, asking personal questions, following her to her car despite her refusals. The officer noted no crime had occurred. Advice was given. The matter was closed. The name of the worker was listed. It matched. The room went still. Not because the report proved murder, but because it proved behavior, a boundary tested and dismissed, a warning documented and forgotten. The team traced the complainant, now living abroad. She agreed to speak, hesitant at first, then increasingly certain as memory resurfaced. She described the man's voice, calm, reassuring, persistent. She remembered how he'd smiled when she told him she didn't need help, how he'd continued walking beside her anyway, talking as if the decision had already been made. She remembered feeling foolish for being scared afterward, for reporting something that hadn't escalated. She remembered the relief when nothing came of it. That testimony reframed everything. Hannah's encounter no longer needed to be dramatic, to be dangerous. It could have been brief, polite, ordinary. An offer of assistance, a suggestion, a shared path that diverted just slightly from where she intended to go. Investigators revisited the theory with renewed clarity. The missing phone wasn't a trophy or a random loss. It was a tool, a way to delay discovery, to fracture the timeline, to buy time in a city that measures its nights in millions of footsteps. They returned to the subject for a second interview, this time with more structure, more precision.
Again, he was calm.
Again, he cooperated. But the questions were different now, sharper, less forgiving. They asked about complaints, about walking people to their cars, about being told no and continuing anyway. His responses tightened. He denied remembering any complaint, suggested misunderstandings, shrugged off concerns as overreactions. And then, when asked directly whether he had ever encountered Hannah Cole before the night she died, he paused longer than before.
He said no.
But his body betrayed him in ways words could not. A hand clenched, then relaxed. His breathing shifted. He asked to repeat the question. It was subtle, The kind of thing that means nothing in isolation and everything in context. The interview ended without confrontation. No accusations were made. No rights were read. Investigators walked away with something more fragile and more valuable than denial. They walked away with a sense of pressure building, of a story beginning to strain under its own weight. Behind closed doors, legal teams were consulted. The threshold for action was discussed carefully. 20 years had passed. The margin for error was razor-thin. A premature move could collapse everything. They needed one piece that tied the man not just to Hannah's world, but to the moment itself. That piece arrived from an unexpected place. A cold case initiative encouraging the public to submit old phones uncovered a device recovered during a house clearance, turned in anonymously, its origin unknown. It was a basic prepaid model, damaged but intact enough to retrieve partial data. Analysts worked painstakingly, reconstructing fragments, timestamps, call logs. One number surfaced repeatedly in early 2003, a number that matched employment records, a work-issued line used briefly and then deactivated. It had called Hannah at 12:32 a.m. The room exhaled. The phone's final location ping placed it near Archer's Row before it went dark forever. It wasn't definitive on its own. Nothing ever is. But combined with everything else, it became a spine around which the case could finally stand upright. Arrest warrants were drafted, reviewed, revised. Every word mattered. Every inference had to be defensible. When the decision was made, it was done quietly, without spectacle. No cameras. No leaks. Officers approached him at home on an ordinary morning, introduced themselves, and asked him to come in for questioning. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, unaware that history was folding in on itself just beyond their sightlines. In custody, confronted with evidence layered slowly, methodically, he maintained his composure until the phone was mentioned. Then something broke. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Just a crack, a loss of precision, the narrative fraying at the edges. He asked how they'd found it. He asked who had turned it in. Questions that betrayed knowledge he had never admitted to having. By the time the interview ended, the air in the room felt different. He hadn't confessed yet. But the shape of the truth was no longer abstract. It was close, heavy, pressing in from all sides. And for the first time since 2003, the silence that had protected him began to feel less like cover and more like a countdown, the city inching toward a moment it had waited 20 years to face. The third interview began without ceremony, no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just a folder placed gently on the table, thick now, heavier than it had ever been. And when he saw it, when he realized how much of his life had been laid out in careful rows, something fundamental shifted. Not fear exactly. More like resignation, the subtle understanding that the space to maneuver had narrowed to almost nothing, that every answer now had to carry the weight of everything that came before it. They started with facts, neutral, almost polite.
Dates. Times.
Employment records. Vehicle access. He answered easily at first, the rhythm familiar, practiced from years of explaining himself to supervisors, inspectors, auditors, people with clipboards who never really wanted to know him. But then the questions tightened, looping back on themselves, revisiting details he thought he'd already settled, pressing gently on inconsistencies that had once been invisible. The prepaid phone came next. Not waved. Not dramatized. Just mentioned, quietly, as if it were an afterthought. The room seemed to contract. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, uncrossed them again, and for the first time, his answers stopped flowing. He asked for clarification, asked how they could be sure, asked what year they were talking about. The calm that had defined him for hours thinned into something brittle. Investigators laid out the call log, the timestamp, the location data. They didn't accuse him of murder. They didn't even say Hannah's name at first. They let the evidence speak, let the implication grow on its own, because implication, once internalized, can be more devastating than confrontation. When they finally said her name, he looked down, not away.
Down.
As if the table suddenly held something fragile he didn't want to disturb. His breathing changed again, shallow now, controlled too carefully, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier confidence. He said he remembered her now. Said it casually, as if recalling a forgotten errand, a face from a crowd. He said they'd talked briefly. Said she'd asked for directions. Said nothing unusual had happened. The detectives let the silence stretch. Silence invites elaboration. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his story began to grow. The brief encounter became a longer conversation. The directions turned into an offer to walk part of the way. The insistence that nothing happened shifted into an explanation of misunderstanding. He spoke about loneliness, about long shifts, about how easy it was to talk to strangers in a city that pretends it doesn't want to be spoken to. He spoke as if context alone could absolve consequence. They asked about the car park near the river. He hesitated, then nodded. Said he'd been there that night. Said it was on his route between sites. Said he sometimes stopped to rest, to make calls. He acknowledged the phone then, admitted it was his, said he'd panicked when the news broke, said he destroyed it later, years later, after convincing himself it didn't matter anymore. Each admission was framed as minor, understandable, human. Together, they formed a different picture entirely. When asked about Archer's Row, he shook his head at first, then stopped, then corrected himself. Said he might have driven past. Said he couldn't be sure. Memory, he claimed, was unreliable after so long. Investigators agreed. Memory was unreliable. That was why they relied on records, on data, on things that didn't forget just because they wanted to. The conversation turned darker then, not in tone, but in gravity. They asked about control, about walking people to their cars, about ignoring refusals, about how it feels to be trusted by default, to be seen as safe because of a uniform, a badge, a role. He bristled at that, pushed back, insisted he'd never hurt anyone, insisted intentions mattered. His voice rose for the first time, not in anger, but in self-defense, as if protecting an identity rather than a truth. The moment came quietly. No shouting. No dramatic reveal. Just a question asked once, and not repeated. Where did Hannah die? He stared at the wall for a long time. Long enough that the room seemed to forget how to breathe. And then he answered, softly, naming a place no one outside the investigation knew to ask about, a service corridor adjacent to the car park, a narrow space lined with industrial carpeting, a place that matched the fibers, the soil, the absence of witnesses, the controlled environment implied by every overlooked detail. The confession that followed was fragmented, cautious, incomplete. He spoke about an argument, about fear, about things getting out of hand. He insisted he hadn't meant to kill her, that it had been an accident, a fall, a moment that spiraled. Investigators didn't interrupt. They knew better than to correct a man narrating his own undoing. He described moving her afterward, panicking, choosing Archer's Row because it was close, because it was dark, because he knew cameras didn't quite meet there. He spoke about the rain as if it were an accomplice, washing away traces he hadn't even known he'd left. By the time the interview ended, the case that had once been defined by absence was heavy with presence. Details. Admissions. Locations. A narrative that finally connected the beginning to the end, without leaving space for doubt. Legal teams moved quickly now, warrants executed, properties searched, old vehicles examined, fragments recovered that corroborated his account in ways that no single piece ever could. When the arrest was made public, it landed like a delayed shockwave. Headlines struggled to contain 20 years of waiting in a single line. London reacted the way it always does, with a mixture of outrage and relief, disbelief and grim recognition. Hannah's parents were told first, privately, the words delivered carefully, gently, as if the truth itself were fragile. They cried. They thanked people they had never met. They asked questions they had rehearsed for decades. The city revisited Archer's Row with new eyes, reporters standing where tape had once fluttered, speaking into microphones about closure, about justice, about lessons learned. But beneath the noise, beneath the commentary, something quieter persisted, The understanding that Hannah's death had never been about darkness or danger in the abstract, but about trust misplaced, routines exploited, and how easily the ordinary can become lethal when no one is looking closely enough. For the man who had lived freely for 20 years, the silence finally broke not with sirens, but with memory, returning all at once, undeniable, irreversible. And as the case moved toward court, toward judgment, toward an ending the city had waited 2 decades to hear, one truth lingered, uncomfortable and inescapable. This wasn't a mystery solved by time, but by attention, by the decision to look again at what had always been there, hiding in plain sight. The confession didn't end the story. It complicated it, because truth, once spoken, doesn't arrive neatly packaged. It arrives jagged, uneven, demanding verification, demanding proof strong enough to survive a courtroom where memory is treated as suspicion and every word is pulled apart until only what can be proven is allowed to stand. Investigators moved quickly, not out of excitement, but out of caution, knowing how fragile late justice can be, how easily it can slip back into doubt if even one link in the chain fails. Search teams returned to places that had gone unexamined for 2 decades, the service corridor he had named, the car park near the river, storage rooms that had been renovated, repainted, repurposed so many times that they barely resembled their former selves. Layers were peeled back carefully, floor coverings lifted, debris sifted, not expecting miracles, just looking for confirmation, for something stubborn enough to have survived time and neglect. And improbably, against all expectations, they found it. Microscopic traces embedded deep beneath newer layers, fibers consistent with Hannah's code, particles that matched soil samples preserved in evidence bags since 2003, details that align not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. The prosecution team assembled its case methodically, building outward from the confession rather than leaning on it, aware that confessions can fracture under pressure. They reconstructed the timeline using independent anchors, CCTV loops, vehicle movement, phone metadata, employment records, and witness statements old and new, weaving them into a narrative that didn't rely on a single moment of admission, but on convergence, on the idea that when enough independent facts point in the same direction, denial becomes irrelevant. Hannah's final movements were laid out minute by minute, her routine contrasted against his, the invisible intersection that had gone unnoticed in 2003 now rendered starkly visible. The court would hear how trust operates in public spaces, how uniforms and access create assumptions, how offers of help can mask control. Expert witnesses explained how predators don't always stalk from shadows, how they often position themselves where refusal feels rude, where compliance feels easier than resistance. When charges were formally announced, the language was careful, restrained, but the impact was anything but. The words murder and Hannah Cole appeared together for the first time in an official document tied to a living suspect, and the city reacted with a collective intake of breath. News outlets replayed old footage, overlaid new facts, reframed familiar images, and for many, the shock wasn't that the case had been solved, but how it had remained unsolved for so long. The accused appeared in court quietly, no dramatic entrance, no visible outburst, just a man standing where a name once stood alone. He pleaded not guilty at first, as advised, the confession recast as confusion, stress, misinterpretation, a story told under pressure after hours of questioning. Defense arguments focused on time, on degraded evidence, on the impossibility of certainty after 2 decades. The strategy was predictable. The prosecution was ready. Hannah's parents attended every hearing, sitting side by side, hands clasped, listening to strangers describe their daughter's final moments in voices stripped of emotion by necessity. They learned details they had never known, things the police had shielded them from when hope still felt possible, and each revelation landed with a delayed force, grief reshaped rather than relieved by answers. Closure, they would later say, was a misleading word. There was no closing of anything, only a reshaping of the pain. As the trial unfolded, more witnesses came forward, people who had dismissed uncomfortable encounters years earlier, now recognizing patterns they hadn't had language for at the time. A woman described being followed to her car. Another recalled a man insisting on conversation she hadn't wanted. None of these incidents had ended in violence. All of them had ended in silence. Together, they formed a backdrop against which Hannah's death no longer looked isolated, but inevitable in a system that taught people to doubt their own instincts. The jury listened. Days turned into weeks. Expert testimony blurred into routine, but certain moments cut through the monotony. The presentation of the phone call record, the timestamp glowing on a screen, the fiber analysis explained with clinical detachment, the map showing how easily Hannah's path intersected with his. The defense challenged each point, suggested alternatives, raised doubts where it could. The prosecution didn't argue emotion. It argued accumulation. Outside the courtroom, Archer's Row became a symbol again, not of fear this time, but of hindsight. Commentators spoke about urban design, about surveillance gaps, about how cities create blind spots not by accident, but by design, and how those blind spots are learned, mapped, and exploited by people who understand them better than anyone else. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without spectacle.
Guilty.
One word, heavy enough to carry 20 years of waiting. Hannah's mother closed her eyes. Her father exhaled, a sound he hadn't realized he'd been holding in since 2003. The man who had once blended into the city so completely was led away, no longer invisible, no longer protected by routine. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would be filed. Legal processes would grind forward as they always do. But the case, the question that had haunted South London for 2 decades, had shifted state. It was no longer open. It was no longer silent. It had spoken, finally, and in doing so, forced the city to confront an uncomfortable truth, that justice delayed doesn't arrive clean, doesn't heal what was broken, it simply arrives late, carrying the weight of everything that was allowed to happen in the meantime. Sentencing day arrived without drama, the way real consequences often do, slipping into the calendar like any other appointment, and yet the air inside the courtroom felt heavier than it ever had, thick with the accumulated weight of 2 decades of waiting. The accused stood again, older now, smaller somehow, his ordinariness finally stripped of its camouflage, and when the judge spoke, the words were precise, restrained, devastating in their clarity. Life imprisonment, a minimum term that acknowledged both the brutality of the crime and the cruelty of time stolen. Years Hannah never lived, years her family never recovered. There was no outburst, no final speech, just the quiet scrape of a chair, the muted shuffle of papers, the sound of a man being led away while the reality of permanence settled over everyone else in the room. Hannah's parents remained seated long after it was over, as if standing too quickly might fracture something fragile inside them, as if movement itself required relearning now that the long vigil had ended. Outside, reporters waited, microphones raised, questions rehearsed, searching for something definitive to say about closure, about justice, about lessons learned. Hannah's mother spoke briefly, her voice steady but distant, thanking those who had refused to let the case disappear, reminding everyone that answers did not erase loss, they only changed its shape. Then she stepped away, into a space cameras were never meant to enter. In the days that followed, the city processed the verdict in fragments. Talk shows debated institutional failure. Editorials dissected how a man with access and trust could operate undetected for so long. Social media filled with anger and retrospective certainty, people insisting they would have noticed, would have acted, would have done something differently. But hindsight is generous. It assumes awareness that rarely exists in the moment. Within the Metropolitan Police, internal reviews were launched quietly, not as public spectacle, but as necessity. Protocols were re-examined, assumptions challenged, the early dismissal of fibers, the lack of follow-up on complaints, the blind spots created by compartmentalized investigations. None of it was malicious. All of it was human, and that, more than anything, unsettled the people tasked with preventing the next tragedy. Training materials were updated. Cold case units expanded. Data-sharing barriers dismantled piece by piece. Hannah's name appeared in presentations not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder of persistence, of the importance of asking why something was ignored rather than simply noting that it was. Change, like justice, arrived slowly, unevenly, but it arrived. For those who had lived near Archer's Row, the alley took on a different resonance. Flowers appeared briefly, then disappeared. Someone painted over old graffiti. The space returned to what it had always been, functional, forgettable, except now people walked through it with a faint awareness of what had happened there, a ripple of memory that lingered just long enough to matter. Hannah's friends gathered privately, sharing stories that had been suspended in time, memories unaltered by the truth, but reframed by it. They spoke about her laugh, her impatience, her habit of cutting conversations short when she was tired. They wondered aloud whether she would have liked the woman she might have become, whether she would have forgiven the city that failed her. No one pretended to know the answers. The man convicted of her murder was transferred, processed, absorbed into a system designed to neutralize him, to remove his capacity to harm, but not his capacity to remember. In interviews conducted later for risk assessment, he spoke less. He answered questions narrowly. He avoided elaboration. The narrative he had once offered under pressure now collapsed into silence, and in that silence, the banality of his choices stood exposed, stripped of justification, reduced to what it had always been. Years from now, his name would fade. Hannah's would not, at least not in the ways that mattered. Scholarships were established. Awareness campaigns launched quietly in her honor, focused on consent, on trust, on the dangers of assuming safety based on appearance or role. None of it was loud. None of it sought attention. It existed to fill spaces where silence had once lived. The cold case that had haunted London for 20 years began to cool in a different way, no longer frozen in uncertainty, but settled into record, into precedent, into cautionary tale. Students of criminology would study it. Detectives would reference it. Families of other victims would draw hope from it, proof that time does not erase truth, it only delays its recognition. And yet, even as the case closed officially, something remained unresolved in the collective psyche of the city. Not about guilt or innocence, but about proximity, about how easily lives intersect without notice, about how many other routines overlap in ways no one has mapped yet. The story of Hannah Cole forced London to acknowledge not just one man's crime, but the architecture that allowed it to go unnoticed, the social habits that smoothed over discomfort, the systems that prioritized efficiency over curiosity. On rainy nights, when reflections pool in alleys and the city hums with its familiar indifference, people still take shortcuts. They still trust uniforms. They still accept help without thinking too hard about why it's being offered. Fear alone is not a solution. Awareness is quieter, harder to sustain, easier to dismiss. But for a moment, after the verdict, London paused, just briefly, and remembered how fragile safety can be when attention drifts. The case would be cited as solved. The files would be marked complete. But for those who carried it, who had lived inside its unanswered questions for 20 years, completion felt like a misnomer. What they felt instead was a shift, a release of pressure, the end of a long-held breath. The city moved on, as cities do, and somewhere between the rain-slick pavement of Archer's Row and the fluorescent quiet of a prison corridor, the truth finally settled into place, not as a triumph, but as a warning that cold cases are never truly cold. They are simply waiting, patient and unyielding, for someone to look again and refuse to look away. The city keeps breathing, but the case does not. London moves forward while the file remains open, its edges soft from handling, its pages stained with fingerprints that lead nowhere, and somewhere between the paperwork and the years, the truth slips into shadow, turning this investigation into something colder, something heavier, a cold case whispered about in back offices and late-night newsrooms, the kind that never quite dies. By the time a decade passes, the witnesses have aged, their memories thinning like old photographs left in the sun. The shop owner on the corner, once certain about the man he saw that night, now hesitates, his confidence eroded by time and doubt. Was the jacket black or dark blue? Was the walk hurried or casual? Did the man glance back, or did that detail grow in his mind later, fed by headlines and conversations? Every answer comes slower now, padded with uncertainty, and every pause feels like another door quietly closing. The physical evidence fares no better. The fibers found on the victim's coat sit sealed in evidence bags, their promise fading as technology stalls, waiting for methods that do not yet exist. The partial DNA profile remains just that, partial, incomplete, a ghost of a person rather than a name. Detectives revisit it periodically, hoping for a miracle, hoping for a database hit that never comes. Each time, the result is the same. No match, no progress. Another reminder of how close and how far they are at the same time. Internally, the case becomes a point of tension. Senior officers want results. Junior detectives want answers. Budgets tighten. Resources are redirected to fresher crimes, louder crimes, cases that bleed in real time instead of haunting quietly from the past. The London 2003 file is not closed, but it is quietly pushed to the side, placed on a shelf where it can be seen without being touched, acknowledged without being pursued. Officially, the investigation continues. In reality, it slows to a crawl. For the victim's family, time does not soften anything. Anniversaries become rituals of pain. Birthdays pass uncelebrated. Empty chairs remain empty. They give interviews on the 10th anniversary, then the 15th, standing in the same spot, repeating the same plea, their voices strained but steady, asking for anyone at all, to come forward. They know the odds. They know the city has moved on. But they also know someone out there remembers something. Someone has carried a secret for years, and secrets have a way of rotting the soul. Rumors, meanwhile, continue to surface like bubbles from a deep, dark river. A former acquaintance of the victim is arrested for an unrelated assault, and whispers spread that he once had a temper, that he once argued loudly near the same street. Detectives check, cross-reference, eliminate. Another lead points to a transient who lived nearby in 2003, a man who vanished from council records soon after the murder. They track him down years later, now living under a different name, older, thinner, frightened. His alibi holds. Another dead end. Each failed lead adds weight, not just to the case but to the people working it. Detectives carry it home, replaying interviews in their heads, wondering if they missed a tremor in a voice, a flicker in the eyes. One retired officer admits years later that he still dreams about the crime scene, the way the streetlight flickered, the unnatural silence after the siren stopped. He wonders if the killer ever dreams too, or if some people sleep peacefully no matter what they've done. As the years roll on, the case takes on a life of its own in the media. Documentaries revisit it, framing it as one of London's great unsolved mysteries. Podcasts dissect every known detail, every inconsistency, every rumor, building theories that spiral outward, some plausible, others wild. The public consumes it like a story, forgetting at times that it is not fiction, that real blood soaked into real pavement, that a real family still waits for justice. Detectives watch this coverage with mixed feelings. On one hand, exposure keeps the case alive, keeps pressure on the system. On the other, speculation muddies the water, turning facts into entertainment and witnesses into performers. Tips pour in after each broadcast, hundreds of them, most useless, some cruel, a few intriguing. Each one must be logged, reviewed, assessed. The work never truly stops. It just changes shape. Then there is the killer, unseen, unnamed, aging somewhere in the same city, or perhaps far away, carrying on with life as if nothing happened. Investigators debate his profile endlessly. Was he impulsive or calculated? Was the murder planned, or did it erupt in a moment of rage? Did he know the victim, or was this a chance encounter that turned fatal? Each theory has merit. Each theory collapses under scrutiny. The killer remains a silhouette, defined only by absence. By the late 2010s, new technology begins to stir quiet hope. Advances in forensic science promise to extract more from less, to breathe life into old samples thought exhausted. Cold case units are restructured, their mandate renewed. The London 2003 file is pulled from the shelf once more, its contents digitized, its evidence re-examined under brighter lights and sharper tools. For the first time in years, the case feels warm again, as if something dormant has begun to stir. Still, progress is agonizingly slow. Tests take months, sometimes years. Results come back inconclusive, or promising but incomplete. The partial DNA profile grows slightly clearer, but still refuses to resolve into a name. It is like trying to see a face through frosted glass. The outline is there, the presence undeniable, but the details remain just out of reach. Inside the department, patience wears thin. Younger detectives, not even in uniform in 2003, now study the case with fresh eyes, unburdened by old assumptions. They question everything, the timelines, the witness statements, the initial focus of the investigation. Why was one suspect dismissed so quickly? Why was a certain CCTV angle never fully explored? These questions reopen old wounds, stir quiet defensiveness among veterans, but they also create cracks where light might enter. And yet, despite the renewed effort, the city remains stubbornly silent. No dramatic confession emerges. No long-lost witness suddenly remembers everything. The killer does not slip up in an obvious way. The case continues to hover in that uncomfortable space between hope and despair, between progress and stagnation, a reminder that some truths resist being uncovered, no matter how hard they are pursued. As the 20th anniversary approaches, the pressure intensifies. Milestones matter in cold cases. They trigger retrospectives, renewed appeals, fresh scrutiny. The family prepares once again to stand before cameras, their faces lined with years of waiting, their grief now a constant companion rather than a sharp wound. Detectives prepare too, aware that time is not on their side, that witnesses age, evidence degrades, and killers grow more comfortable with silence. London, indifferent as ever, watches from a distance. The street where it happened looks different now, new shops, new residents, brighter lights. But for those who know, the past still clings to the bricks. Walk there late at night, and you can almost feel it, the echo of footsteps, the moment where everything went wrong, the unanswered question hanging in the air like fog. The case is still unsolved. Officially. Publicly. But beneath the surface, something is shifting. Tiny movements, almost imperceptible, begin to align. A name reappears in a database. A sample yields a clearer signal. A timeline tightens, just enough to squeeze the truth. No one announces it yet. No one dares to believe too much. But after 20 years of silence, the case that refused to die begins, quietly, to whisper back. The whisper grows louder not with a bang but with paperwork, with database pings that arrive at odd hours, with an analyst pausing mid-keystroke because something finally lines up, a probability curve bending in a way it never has before, and in that small, fluorescent-lit room the past suddenly feels present, heavy, impatient, as if the case itself has been waiting for this exact moment to exhale. The partial DNA profile, long dismissed as too thin to matter, has been run again through a newer system, one designed to find distant echoes rather than perfect matches, and what comes back is not a name but a direction, a familial thread stretching outward like a nerve, pointing not to the killer, but to someone related, someone close enough to matter. Detectives gather around the screen, silent, reading the same lines again and again, afraid to speak too soon, afraid of jinxing the fragile progress, because they've been here before, teased by near misses and false dawns, but this feels different, sharper, anchored in numbers rather than hope. The software suggests a cluster of relatives scattered across the UK, ordinary people with ordinary records, and somewhere among them is the person who left blood on a London street in 2003 and walked away believing he'd beaten time. The work begins quietly. No press. No announcements. Just careful, methodical digging. Family trees are built from public records and private databases, branches sprawling backward and forward across decades. Birth certificates, marriages, deaths, addresses, all layered until patterns start to emerge. One branch stands out, not because it screams guilt, but because it intersects the case in subtle, unsettling ways.
A man.
mid-30s in 2003. Lived less than a mile from the crime scene. No criminal record worth noting. Moved shortly after the murder. Nothing explosive. Just enough to raise eyebrows. Surveillance follows, low-key, patient. The suspect is older now, grayer, heavier. A life lived mostly under the radar. He works a regular job. Has a family. Neighbors describe him as quiet, polite, forgettable. The kind of person no one would ever point to in a lineup of monsters. Detectives watch him go about his days, carrying groceries, checking his phone, laughing occasionally, and it's unsettling, the normalcy of it, the way the past seems to sit comfortably alongside the present. They need confirmation. A clean DNA sample. Not from evidence. From him. But 20 years have taught the team caution. One mistake, one premature move, and the thread could snap. They wait. They plan. They coordinate with prosecutors, knowing that cold cases demand precision, that memories fade but legal standards do not. Every step is weighed against the risk of losing everything. The break comes in an unremarkable way. A discarded coffee cup. A cigarette butt. Something touched casually, tossed without thought. It's collected quietly, bagged, rushed to the lab like a fragile relic. Days stretch. Hours crawl. Everyone pretends to focus on other work, but the air is charged, conversations clipped, eyes drifting toward phones that refuse to ring. When the result finally arrives, it doesn't arrive loudly. No alarms. No dramatic reveal. Just a lab report, clinical and devastating, stating that the DNA from the discarded item matches the partial profile from 2003 to a statistical certainty so high it feels unreal, a number with too many zeros to ignore. For a moment, no one speaks. Some stare at the page. Others lean back, hands over mouths. One detective closes his eyes, the weight of 20 years pressing down all at once. They move quickly now. The suspect is brought in for questioning under a pretext, invited rather than arrested, the room neutral, almost polite. He sits across from detectives who were younger men or not even on the force when he last sat in a room like this, and he doesn't know yet that the ground beneath him has shifted. At first, he's calm, cooperative, answers questions about his past with practiced ease. Yes, he lived in the area back then. Yes, he remembers the night vaguely. No, he didn't know the victim. No, he wasn't involved. They let him talk. Silence does the heavy lifting. They slide photographs across the table, not accusatory, just factual. The street.
The time.
The years. His posture changes subtly, shoulders tightening, jaw setting. He asks why they're asking him this now. 20 years later. The question hangs there, heavy with irony. Then they mention the DNA. It's not dramatic. No shouting. No sudden collapse. Just a flicker. A fraction of a second where the mask slips, where calculation gives way to something raw and exposed. He recovers quickly, asks for a lawyer, but the damage is done. The detectives have seen it. They've waited decades for that moment, for the confirmation that the whisper was real. The arrest comes later, formally, carefully. The headline breaks not with a leak, but with a press conference, cameras clicking as officials step forward to announce what once seemed impossible. The London 2003 cold case has been solved. A suspect in custody. A killer named. Gasps ripple through the room. Reporters scramble, hands raised, voices overlapping, all chasing the same question. How could it take 20 years? The answer is complicated. It's technology. It's persistence. It's luck. It's timing. It's the slow, grinding work of people who refuse to let a file gather dust forever. Outside, the city reacts with shock and disbelief. Social media explodes. Old articles resurface. Podcasts update their feeds in real time. The story that once belonged to the past is suddenly, violently present again. For the family, the news lands differently. There is relief, yes, but it's cautious, tangled with grief that has had 2 decades to harden. They are informed privately before the press, sitting together as detectives explain what has happened, how it was done, what comes next. Some cry. Some sit in stunned silence. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not erase loss. It only reshapes it. The suspect, now defendant, is charged. The evidence is laid out piece by piece, old and new interwoven into a narrative that finally makes sense. The fibers, the timeline, the movements, the DNA that refused to disappear. In court documents, the crime is stripped of mystery, reduced to actions and consequences, but the weight of it remains, a reminder of how long the truth can hide in plain sight. London watches again, this time with a different energy. The street where it happened fills with reporters, cameras pointed at bricks that have seen too much. Neighbors talk to journalists, stunned to learn who lived among them, who shared walls and smiles and casual greetings. The idea that evil can wear such an ordinary face unsettles everyone. As the trial looms, detectives reflect quietly. There is satisfaction, but no celebration. Solving a case like this doesn't feel like victory. It feels like closing a wound that never healed properly, stitching together time and loss and unanswered questions into something resembling an ending. The killer is no longer a silhouette.
He has a name,
A face, a history. But the echoes of 2003 do not fade overnight. They linger in interviews, in courtroom sketches, in the way the family stands a little straighter now, carrying not closure but certainty. The whisper that began in a database has become a roar, and for the first time in 20 years, the case is no longer silent. The verdict arrives without ceremony, delivered in a voice trained to remain steady no matter the weight of the words, and when it lands it feels less like an explosion and more like a door closing, slow, final, the sound echoing down a corridor that has been open for 20 years.
guilty.
The syllables are simple, almost fragile, yet they carry with them a gravity that bends the room, pulling breath from chests, drawing quiet tears from faces that have rehearsed this moment in their heads for decades without ever believing it would truly come. The defendant barely reacts. He has had time to prepare, time to watch the net tighten, time to understand that the past he buried has finally clawed its way back to the surface. He stares ahead, jaw locked, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something only he can hear, a private reckoning that no sentence can fully articulate. When he is led away, the sound of footsteps fades quickly, swallowed by the courtroom stillness, leaving behind a space heavy with unresolved emotion. For Hannah's family, the moment is almost disorienting. They have lived so long in the absence of answers that certainty feels foreign, like a language they once knew but haven't spoken in years. Relief comes in waves, uneven, colliding with grief that has never softened, only learned to hide. There is no moment of triumph, no sense of victory, just the quiet acknowledgement that the truth, at last, has a place to stand. Outside, London absorbs the outcome in its own distracted way. Headlines flare, then fade.
News cycles move on.
Another story replaces this one by the end of the week, but something subtle has shifted beneath the noise. People talk differently now about cold cases, about time, about the idea that justice can outweigh the lies told to escape it. Detectives receive messages from families of other victims, tentative, hopeful, asking if maybe, just maybe, their stories could still be heard too. Within the police force, the case becomes a reference point, not just for its resolution, but for what it represents. A reminder that evidence does not expire, that mistakes, once buried, can still be corrected, that patience, paired with progress, can resurrect truths long assumed lost. Training sessions mention Hannah's name not as a failure, but as proof that persistence matters, that the quiet work done in the background can eventually change everything. The alley where it happened returns to anonymity, brick and shadow and foot traffic, yet it carries an invisible scar, one that only those who know the story can feel. People pass through it every day, unaware, while others slow their steps just slightly, acknowledging a history that refuses to disappear completely. Memory clings to places like damp air, unseen but undeniable. At home, Hannah's parents sort through boxes they once avoided, photographs untouched since 2003, letters she never mailed, fragments of a life interrupted. They talk about her more freely now, without the constant ache of not knowing. They allow themselves to imagine her again, not just as a victim frozen in time, but as a person who existed beyond the moment that took her away. It doesn't lessen the pain. It reshapes it, gives it edges they can finally grasp. The man responsible will spend the rest of his life behind walls designed to erase individuality, his name reduced to a line in a registry, his freedom exchanged for a routine he cannot escape. History will remember him briefly, then not at all. That is how it should be. The story was never meant to belong to him. What remains is the echo of the case itself, a reminder whispered through courtrooms, police stations, and late-night conversations that cold cases are not ghosts, they are unfinished sentences, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right stubborn refusal to let silence win. London learned that lesson slowly, painfully over 20 years, and it will carry it forward whether it wants to or not. As night falls, the city resumes its familiar rhythm, traffic humming, lights flickering on, levs intersecting and separating without notice. Somewhere in that motion is the understanding that time does not protect the guilty, it only tests the resolve of those willing to keep looking. And long after the cameras are gone, after the files are closed and the headlines archived, the truth of the London 2003 cold case settles into the collective memory, not as a neat ending, but as a quiet warning that even the longest shadows can be pulled into the light, if someone is patient enough to wait and brave enough to look again. Years later, when the noise is thinned and the story has been compressed into a paragraph in a textbook or a footnote in a documentary, the case still breathes in small, unexpected ways, surfacing in conversations between detectives who were never there, in late-night reviews of old files, in the quiet confidence of a junior analyst who now believes that nothing is truly beyond reach. The London 2003 cold case does not sit still in the past. It migrates forward, carried by those who learned from it, shaping decisions in rooms that look nothing like the one where Hannah's life ended. The technology that cracked it continues to evolve, faster now, hungrier, able to see connections once invisible, and with each advancement comes a reckoning, an understanding that the past is not done with us simply because we've turned the page. Old evidence is reopened, boxes lifted from shelves, labels rewritten with steadier hands. What was once dismissed as noise becomes signal. What was once impossible becomes merely difficult. The lesson lingers. Patience is not passive, it is active, disciplined, relentless. For the family, time does something gentler now. It does not heal, not fully, but it loosens the grip of uncertainty that once tightened around every memory. They attend a small gathering each year, not a vigil, not a protest, just a moment to mark a life that mattered. Stories are told without hesitation. Laughter appears, surprising and welcome, not as betrayal, but as proof that love outlasts violence. They have learned that closure is a myth, but clarity is not, and clarity has given them space to breathe. The city, too, carries the imprint. Policies change quietly. Training emphasizes listening longer, questioning assumptions, revisiting what feels settled. Officers are taught to distrust convenience, to recognize how easily routine can dull curiosity. There is no plaque in Archer's Row, no official marker, but there is a shared, unspoken awareness among those who know, a recognition that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Occasionally, a journalist returns to the story, chasing a retrospective angle, asking what it all means now. The answers are never simple. It means justice can be delayed without being denied. It means systems fail and can be repaired. It means monsters do not always announce themselves. But beneath every soundbite is a quieter truth, one harder to package, that vigilance is not a moment. It is a practice, sustained over years, even decades. In police archives, the file remains, no longer active, but not forgotten. It is pulled during training, during audits, during moments when someone needs reminding why the slow work matters. The pages are worn, corners soft from handling, a physical testament to endurance. Names written there are read carefully now, with respect, with an understanding of the human weight behind each line of text. And somewhere, in the collective consciousness of London, the case has settled into a kind of low hum, not fear, not obsession, but awareness. People still walk alone at night. They still trust. They still live. But there is an added layer now, a subtle attentiveness, a recognition that questions asked too late can cost everything, and questions asked again can change it. The London 2003 cold case was solved, yes, but its true resolution lies not in a verdict or a sentence, but in the way it altered the future, in the doors it quietly opened, in the refusals it inspired. It stands as a reminder that time is not an eraser, that truth is resilient, and that even in the longest darkness, there are traces left behind, waiting, patient and unyielding, for someone willing to follow them all the way to the end.